Angela Davis, about 10 years ago, published a great essay called Racialized Punishment and Prison Abolition, in which, among other things, she talks about the great carceral systems that underlie and precede and indeed anticipate the hideous carceral prison industrial complex that we find ourselves saddled with today. Among those are slavery, the convict lease system, the mission system, Japanese internment camps, and I think we're going to hear probably about one or several of those systems in this first panel this morning, which is called The Historical Foundation of Race and Punishment. And I guess we'll start with Mary Ellen Curtin of George Washington University. Her paper is called Please Hear Our Cries, Slavery, the Unfree, and the Hidden History of Black Prisoners in America, 1910 to 1955.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. When I finished writing my first book, Black Prisoners in Their World, in 2000, I had one thought, never again. My study traced the largely unknown and very brutal world of convict leasing and prison mining for profit in late 19th century Alabama. I had researched a horrific world of torture, murder, forced labor, coal mining, injustice, greed, thwarted reform, and general hopelessness. And uncovering this system was both appalling and interesting and challenging at every turn. And in the end, I did feel very proud of my research, but also I felt I had it. I felt ready to move to a more uplifting topic. I felt I can't do this again. I mean, logically, you stay in your discipline, and the next logical thing would be to do another book on Alabama prisons, and I couldn't do it. So I was teaching in Texas at the time, and the recent death of former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan caught my attention. And I remembered Barbara Jordan from my girlhood. I had seen her on television. I remembered her voice and her famous summer of 1974 Watergate speech. Her death at the early age of 59 and the newspaper coverage that ensued made me look more deeply into her background, and I wondered why more had not been written about her. And to make a long story short, I discovered, of course, her story is very interesting. It seemed to cut across many things that had been written about the civil rights movement, and also for very strange reasons, historians had sort of ceded her story to the juvenile nonfiction market, which was all too happy to sell her as a very sort of simple embodiment of the American dream. In numerous books designed to be sold to preteens, Barbara Jordan simply worked hard, ate her vegetables, and became the first black woman from the South elected to Congress. So, I call this the She Ate Her Vegetables School of Historical Interpretation. So I embarked on a very long journey to correct this lacuna in the literature and get away from prisons. One of the first books I read about her was her autobiography, which she co-authored with a novelist by the name of Shelby Heron. And the first chapter concerns her maternal grandfather, a man by the name of John Edd Patton. As Barbara Jordan tells it, no one had a greater influence upon her than Grandpa Patton. After her birth in 1936, Grandpa Patton put Barbara's photo in his wallet, kept it there for the rest of his life, and he made Barbara part of his rebel world, and he was a rebel. Grandpa Patton operated a junkyard in his backyard. He made a living collecting rags and rubbish in a mule-driven cart in urban Houston. His rented house in a very poor black Houston ghetto had no indoor plumbing or electricity. He never attended the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, as did the rest of the Jordans and his wife. He stayed home. But on Sunday afternoons, while the rest of the family went back to church, young Barbara was allowed to stay with him. And she said, I remember it as a super time. They ate regulars, the throwaway at the end of the ribs that he got from the local barbecue joint. She remembered this as the most delicious kind of meat, a treat they both loved, but was not normally served in either household. And after they had eaten, they sat down, and he read to her from his Bible and taught her many lessons about life and about power. And Grandpa said, you had to love the world without trusting it, and power always had to be respected. As a girl, there were many things Barbara did not know about her grandfather. She said, Grandfather died my freshman year at Texas Southern University. There were some things about him I never got straight. I'd heard at one point he'd been to prison. Not from my mother and father, no, but that's what I say. I just pick up these little things from various people. I heard that he'd killed a white man, but I also know that back then he couldn't have killed a white man and lived. Now we know that. That would have been the end of him. and I never would have known my grandfather. The facts were eventually revealed. Grandpa Patton had owned a small store in Houston's 4th Ward, and during the spring of 1918, he was working late one night when an intruder tried to rob him. John Edd Patton took his gun, ran out into the dark street, and fired a shot at a shadow. But that figure turned out to be a white police officer. The shot missed, and no physical harm was done, but Patton was arrested and charged with attempted murder. He hired a lawyer, but the entire defense was to no avail. John Edd Patton was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years in the Texas State Penitentiary. You could say he was fortunate. After all, the shooting incident involved a white police officer just a few months after the deadly Houston race riot of 1917, which left dozens of white officers and white citizens dead. White police were known for their brutal treatment of black Houstonians, and indeed it had been a case of police brutality that had set off the riot initially. So given the context, the undoubted anger of white officers, the harsh response, which had ended up in the hanging of dozens of black soldiers who never fired a shot at anyone after that riot, John Edd's sentence was perhaps fortunate. Where did he go? In Texas, the leasing system in which private individuals paid the state for the labor of prisoners had been abolished in 1912. Although prisoners now worked on state-owned farms, the abuses did not end. Prisoners were dispensed to work in fields, quote, in cages mounted on flatbed trucks, shackled together by metal chokers attached by chains. The guards whipped prisoners, and the food they ate was abysmal. Real meat was for free people. Prisoners ate sow belly, peas, and spoiled cornbread, as had slaves. Incredibly, there is no book that details the history of state-run Texas prisons after 1912. But this 1937 letter, written by prisoners incarcerated at the Ramsey State Farm near Houston, paints an unforgettable picture. To the NAACP, please hear our cries. We are prisoners in the Texas State Prison located at Ramsey Farm. We are Negroes. Here as follows are some true facts which we are asking you all to investigate, please. These officials are cruel to us. We have in each building 2 prisoners as building tenders, and they is allowed to kill you if they see fit. They have whips with iron handles and knives. On this camp in 1936, they will do what the captains and guards tell them. Captain Booker Smith was told to kill Dave Lamar, so he did stab him to the heart. It was claimed in self-defense. The letter also went on to describe torture and another murder. A Negro convict was, quote, handcuffed and chained, his hand also with a 1/4-inch chain. The chain was fastened to his prisoner's feet and around his neck, pulling him down to his knees, and he was made to sit on the concrete floor. And this building tender, Booker Smith, whipped this prisoner to death. These are the true things are now going on, and the rules of the prison system don't allow it, but that only a sham. Now, in 1924, Texas Governor Ma Ferguson pardoned John Edd Patton as part of a much bigger, very interesting kind of act that she did when she was elected governor. And he returned home to Houston. In his absence, one of his sons had died, and his wife and daughter, Arlene, had taken in boarders to survive. But financial and emotional hardship remained. The shame of prison, the loss of a brother, the poverty that then came to her family, and many, many years of secrets. These were the legacies of prison for Arlene Patton, Barbara's mother. I thought I could turn the page on the black prison experience by starting another project in black history, but I could not. Prison is a central part of Barbara Jordan's story, a central part of black history, and central to the American experience. But how do we write this history? I think we lack a framework for placing prison experience within the context of our nation's history. What can we say about the prison experience that illuminates history beyond that of chronicling the evolution of an institution or writing still more state histories? And to get a broader national picture of the black prison experience in the early 20th century, I turned to the papers of the NAACP, concerned with, quote, discrimination in the criminal justice system, 1910 to 1955. Now, this is not a huge collection, but the documents reveal the conflicts faced by many African Americans in prison all over the country. Escaping from prison, in trouble with the law, victims of police brutality. Letters from ordinary people seeking legal assistance describe matters ranging from police brutality to landlord problems to those on the run from one bad situation to another. Time and again, the NAACP had to remind the people who wrote to them that the organization was not, quote, a legal aid society. They had nowhere else to go. The NAACP said they could only take cases where the person involved was unquestionably innocent and where a legal challenge would promote a greater cause, such as anti-lynching. The cases rejected file is huge and comes from individuals from all major states, including Florida, Texas, and New York. Now, occasionally the NAACP did successfully represent individuals from southern states who fled the scene of a crime or a southern prison and said, we don't want to go back because we fear we're going to be lynched. And they did prevent dozens of such extraditions through the 1920s and the 30s. And the NAACP also became involved in police brutality cases. Now, in the early 19th century, so these were called the extradition cases, and so people who were on the run or had escaped from prison then were being sought. Their return to these southern states was being sought, and then they asked the NAACP to defend them, and that they actually did succeed in keeping them from returning to the South in several of these cases. So I got interested in this, and I thought, well, maybe like in the early 19th century, runaways who symbolized the injustice of slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act, this prompted public outrage in the North. There was something similar going on here with prisoners. And perhaps this is why the NAACP briefly thought about using these extradition cases to arouse public awareness. To that end, Charles Hamilton Houston wrote to the Board of Directors in 1937 and suggested that the organization sponsor a speaker, the brother of the white man whose story was immortalized in the 1930s film, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. Paul Smith had escaped from a chain gang in Georgia, made his way to New York, where he was arrested and then returned to Georgia. Houston thought this case might generate some controversy. He tentatively suggested that a minister involved go on a speaking tour in Massachusetts, see what financial returns might come from this. NAACP is strapped for cash. Maybe we can get some money to further these cases. But this seems not to have happened. This idea fizzled. And you can see why. The northern public does not seem to express any outrage, really, about the conditions of southern prisons, not even if the victims were white. As a fundraising measure or as a way of public education, prisoners simply do not attract the kind of positive attention the young organization needed. The NAACP also acknowledged that very little could be done once someone had been incarcerated. Furthermore, the NAACP had to contend with stereotypes in the North of the black criminal. One example from their files involves the case of a black man on trial for murdering a choir girl walking home from church one evening in the winter of 1921 in New Jersey. There were threats to lynch the man, as they had done in the South. Newspapers fanned the flames of public outrage by running stories about this particular defendant's alleged sexual license with French women during the First World War and his appearance. Has frame of a gorilla, the newspaper said. He is a gorilla-like black, if there ever was one. And so this stereotype of black criminality was, of course, a national vision, but it deeply influenced public perception of prisoners in general. So the NAACP focused on keeping people out of prison and helping those who had escaped from the South from being put back in prison. But once you were actually in prison, there was simply not a lot that could be done. Simply exposing the mistreatment of a prisoner failed to change many practices. Negative stereotypes of convicted men and women persisted, and abuse prevailed, even when you have the shift to a state-run as opposed to a convict lease system. And although reform shifted the burden and financial responsibility to the state, treatment really had barely improved in the early 20th century. So the story of John Edd Patton and some of these letters from the prisoners in the NAACP files, I think, challenge us to try and reconceptualize, try and think of different ways we can, new ways we can think about this early 20th century prison history. Now, one emerging theme or debate concerns the relationship between the modern prison and slavery. And, the word slavery, I think, is being recuperated now in many different ways in our modern life. It's now often used to describe the situation of people throughout the world held in various forms of bondage, whose labor is exploited, their sexuality bought and sold. I think, 10 or 20 years ago, we talked about the trafficking, right? Trafficking of women and children. And now I think it's more common to use the word slavery. And you can see this in much of the literature on prisons. The Parchment prison after emancipation has been called worse than slavery by historian David Oshinsky. Douglas Blackman has called the post-emancipation prison slavery by another name, and he draws on the work of Pete Daniel to show the widespread system of forced labor or peonage that was fueled by the court system. And again, if you don't know the particulars of this, but basically in places like Alabama, if you were convicted and sent to prison, you were sent to work to forced labor. In Alabama, often in a coal mine. But even if you were just given a fine, you were still caught in the system of, and could have been released, you were still caught in the system of peonage, and often had to work on a farm for the person who had paid your fine with little hope of redress or escape. Whippings, beatings, exploitation, the lack of legal redress with the outside world often characterize the Southern prison experience. Why not call it slavery? But having done that, once we do that, then where does it take us? What more can be said about it? And so it seems to me that maybe the most important question is not whether prison is or isn't slavery, but to ask how the legacy of slavery influenced and continues to shape how we treat the unfree and our assumptions about unfree people. I think to do this, we need to acknowledge that modern prisoners, and I think even people in the 21st century, are part of the long history of the unfree in America, and that includes slaves, but many other groups as well. The slavery experience in the U.S., I think, set a very low bar, a very low standard for how we treat the unfree. Whipping, offers for rewards to capture runaways, brutal punishments for infringing rules, placing prisoners under the personal authority of a warden or a sheriff with practically unlimited power, lack of oversight. All of these practices were derived from the methods of control used under slavery. Many of the first people who used prison labor were former slave owners. They wanted to continue their ways of abuse and power, and the prison system gave them the opportunity to pursue that end. Prisoners were then the new unfree, and what could have once been done to slaves could now be done to them, and worse. And I think this helps to explain, in part, the modern indifference to the incarcerated and our acceptance of their treatment. Slavery may have been abolished and some of the worst physical abuses halted, but our assumptions of how the unfree deserve to be treated remain. You can see this in recent newspaper articles. In Alabama, in January, there was a story of a sheriff who starved his prisoners while pocketing the difference from his unused $1.50 daily fee. This earned a very bemused headline in the New York Times, but it didn't lead to any real analysis of how the profit motive skewers and drives our current system of incarceration as well. It was just sort of seen as this kind of interesting sidelight. Florida imprisons the indigent ex-prisoner for court costs. You can be imprisoned for not paying your court costs in Florida. To meet its mounting debt, again, this was another article that appeared a couple of days ago in the Times. And other states look on not with horror but with interest, thinking, we could do that too. That sounds good. The legacy of slavery remains strong. It defines what can be done to the unfree and bestows upon them the lowest status imaginable in our society. So I think prison history has to include, I think, maybe a new conceptualization of thinking, well, not of people just as criminals, but as part of this long legacy of people who have been denied liberty, who they are the unfree, and how do we treat them? I also think it might be interesting, it's very important that prison history includes how people are made unfree. How do they end up convicted and in prison? In the NAACP papers, nearly every prisoner who wrote starts his story in prison by what happened to him, how he or she got there. People don't divorce their crimes, and I put that in quotes, from their treatment in prison. To them, it's all part of a continuous experience. And I think as part of this long history of the unfree, the police and the courts are a disciplining force that have to come to center stage. How are the unfree controlled? How are they disciplined? And I think we need more studies that link these two together. In his important study of segregation in the Jim Crow era, Trouble in Mind, Litwack has a whole chapter called Acts, which treats the entire legal experience of the prisoner from trial to incarceration. Also, of course, pointing out the distorted numbers of prisoners, the racial distortion, particularly in the South, how this attracts very little notice. There are practically no white prisoners at all in Alabama in the late 19th century. So I think the prison experience is linked to the experience of legal repression, and they have to be addressed together. Another theme begging to be explored is how prison history illustrates the history of torture in America and resistance to it. And I see this is a theme of the conference, and I'm glad to see that, because I think the shock over prison conditions in Guantanamo, the use of torture at Abu Ghraib led to much outrage, because I think of the myth that prior to these events, American prisons did not torture their inmates. But this is not the case. I found evidence in 1880 of Alabama guards using water torture. It's waterboarding, and they're doing it in 1880. Here's a testimony from a guard. A prisoner, quote, was strapped down on his back, then water was poured on his face, on the upper lip, and effectually stops his breathing as long as there is a constant stream. They called it water torture. We call it waterboarding now. This is in the 1880s. As the above quote indicates, and as numerous books show, prisoners in late 19th and early 20th century systematically tortured inmates. Thurgood Marshall reminded the governor of Texas of this in 1937. He said, "We cannot too strongly urge upon you the seriousness of such offenses, which, even though committed by persons in charge of a prison, are nevertheless brutal murders." Throughout the 19th and 20th century, the people who speak out against torture, and most passionately against it, are its victims. Prisoners complained. They complained about torture, and they asserted their humanity and their political rights. They wrote to the NAACP and often referred to violations of rules or the simple immorality of their treatment. They wrote to complain about their torture in sweat boxes, their whippings, and unlawful death. Whipping was especially abhorred. In a letter written from a camp in Georgia, a prisoner by the name of J.B. Reynolds wrote, "We work until sundown, and then on top of that, they whip J.B. He told the captain he was tired and worn out, and they whip him with a stick of wood 3 feet by 4 feet long and 2 inches round. I've been whipped 14 times since 1930. I know the date and the month of every time they whip me." And this is, these letters often talk about treatment, and particularly of whippings and other kinds of torture. Now, why should historians pay attention to this, how prisoners themselves interpreted their status and their rights? Many reasons. I think these critiques speak to and reflect what historian Rebecca McClellan identifies as a crisis of legitimacy, a permanent state of crisis in the American penal system. Furthermore, their voices mitigate the institutional forces which seek to make them anonymous. Prejudice against the unfree leads to numerous assumptions about their horrific treatment. And finally, these are people who are speaking out against torture long before it was recognized as a crime. This is testimony. And I think it stands out as important and unique. Finally, as Barbara Jordan's own family history shows, another way to conceptualize prison history is a hidden history because of the shame involved. Nobody in her family ever talked about this. It was this big suppressed secret. When her book came out, it was almost as important that it was about her, but it was also seen as a vindication of her grandfather. That was almost as equally important to the family as her achievements. Prisoners are inaccessible. Their stories are not often believed or investigated. The shame of being unfree and incarcerated remains. The fate of prisoners is not discussed in families, so we really have to dig at this history. When Barbara Jordan's co-author, Shelby Heron, wrote this about Jordan's beloved grandfather, John Edd Patton, she wrote, "Each time that Barbara recounts him, recreates him, brings his presence back into her own, the cadence and the timbre is what is known as, quote, the Barbara Jordan voice. I asked her, how did you learn to talk that way? And she said, at my grandfather's knee. Through his granddaughter, Barbara Jordan, we heard the voice of John Edd Patton, prisoner. And through letters, prisoners plead, please hear our cries. The voices of prisoners speak to us in many ways, but we have to be ready to listen." Thank you.